In 1970, a University of Chicago economist wrote an essay for the New York Times Magazine. It was not a particularly long essay, about 3,000 words. It was not particularly complicated. It ran under a headline that did most of the work by itself: a Friedman Doctrine, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Footnote 1. But here's the thing. In 1970, that sentence was not obviously true. It was not the consensus. It was, at the time, one argument among several, competing with a view of the corporation that had dominated American business thinking for most of the post-war era, in which companies were expected to answer to employees, communities, and customers, not just shareholders. 56 years later, we don't experience it as an argument anymore. We experience it as a fact of nature, the water the entire system swims in. Nobody at a shareholder meeting has to defend the idea that shareholder value comes first. It's assumed. It's the operating system, not an app running on top of it. Operating systems get installed. Someone chooses the defaults. Everything we've talked about in this series, the gap, the buybacks, the layoffs that lift the stock price, follows from that installation. This episode is about how it got installed, who did it, and whether it had to happen this way. The mechanics that developed the doctrine. Before we get to Friedman, we need to be precise about what came before him, because the before is where this episode's argument actually lives. For roughly 3 decades after World War II, American corporate governance operated under something economists now call managerial capitalism. Not because managers were saints, but because they were relatively insulated. Ownership was diffuse. Institutional investors held a small share of the market. Hostile takeovers were rare and, in some cases, close to impossible to execute at scale. A CEO in 1960 answered to a board that was, more often than not, drawn from the same social and professional world he was, and that board did not face the constant, structural pressure of activist shareholders threatening to replace it. That insulation had a real effect on behavior. Executives in this period routinely described their job, in public and in writing, as balancing the claims of several groups. Shareholders, yes, but also employees, customers, suppliers, and the communities where they operated. This wasn't purely altruism. It was, in part, simply what the incentive structure allowed. When you don't face quarterly pressure from an activist fund, you can afford to think about headcount as an asset instead of a cost to be trimmed before the next earnings call. This is what economists Lynn Stout and, separately, William Lazanick and Mary O'Sullivan, have each documented at length. Shareholder primacy is not the natural default condition of a corporation. Footnote 2. It is a specific doctrine that had to argue its way into dominance, against a competing model that had real institutional weight behind it. Here's the term you need for the rest of this episode: fiduciary duty. Under Delaware corporate law, and roughly 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware, which makes its case law the de facto national standard, corporate directors owe fiduciary duties to the corporation and its shareholders. What those duties actually require, in practice, has shifted enormously over time through case law, without the underlying statute changing very much at all. The words stayed the same. What courts decided the words meant did not. That distinction matters because it's the mechanism by which an essay in a magazine, not a law, not a regulation, nothing with the force of statute behind it, was able to reshape how a multi-trillion-dollar economy actually operates. Friedman didn't change the law. He changed what people believed the law already required, and belief did most of the rest of the work. The evidence uncovered and examined. So what did the essay actually say? Friedman's argument, stripped to its core: a corporate executive is an employee of the shareholders. His job is to conduct the business according to their desires, which Friedman assumed to be making as much money as possible within the rules of the game. Spending shareholder money on anything else, reducing pollution beyond what regulation requires, for instance, or keeping a plant open to protect the town's economy, was, in Friedman's framing, effectively spending other people's money without their consent. He called the alternative pure and unadulterated socialism. Footnote 3. It's worth being fair to the argument because the series' premise commits us to that. Friedman was not making a case for cruelty. He believed diffuse, competitive markets, with executives focused narrowly on returns and everyone else pursuing their own interests within the law, would, in aggregate, produce better outcomes than a system where unelected executives decided unilaterally what counted as socially responsible. There's a real argument in there about accountability. who appointed the CEO to decide what's good for society, and what happens when that judgment is wrong. Here's the contrasting pair. In 1965, the average large company CEO earned about 21 times the pay of a typical worker, by the calculation later popularized by the Economic Policy Institute. Footnote 4. By 2024, per the AFL-CIO's Executive Pay Watch, that ratio was 285 to 1, a figure this series has already cited in Episode 2. Same corporate structure. Same legal system mostly. A near 14-fold expansion in the gap, over roughly 60 years, tracking almost exactly the period in which shareholder primacy went from contested idea to unquestioned default. Now the transmission mechanism, the part that turns an economist had an opinion, into the entire economy reorganized around it. The Business Roundtable, an association of CEOs from the country's largest companies, was founded in 1972, 2 years after Friedman's essay, and its earliest statements on corporate purpose were explicitly stakeholder-oriented, calling on companies to be, in the group's own 1981 language, a positive force in society, with responsibilities to customers, employees, communities, suppliers and shareholders alike. Footnote 5. For a quarter century after Friedman published, in other words, the country's most powerful CEO lobby was still officially saying the opposite of what he'd argued. Then in 1997 that changed. The Business Roundtable's new principles of corporate governance declared, the paramount duty of management and of boards of directors is to the corporation's stockholders. Footnote 6. Every other constituency, employees, communities, customers, was now explicitly subordinate, described in the document as relevant only as a derivative of that primary duty. 27 years after the essay. One sentence had finally become institutional policy, adopted by the CEOs who ran the companies that would go on to buy back nearly $1 trillion of their own stock a year, a figure this series covered in Episode 2. The human scale version. Imagine an idea that takes almost 3 decades to fully move from a magazine article to the operating manual of the American corporation, and once it arrives, it never really leaves. Why it stays this way? If shareholder primacy was a choice, not a law of physics, why hasn't it been unchosen? Reform Effort 1. Change corporate law directly, require boards to consider stakeholders by statute rather than as a courtesy. A small number of U.S. states have passed constituency statutes that permit exactly this. Permit, not require. A board that wants to keep ignoring everyone but shareholders can still do so lawfully in every one of those states. Reform Effort 2. Benefit corporations and B Corp certification. A legal structure that bakes stakeholder consideration into a company's charter. Real and growing and still a rounding error against the S&P 500. Founders choose it voluntarily. Nothing compels an existing public company to convert. Reform Effort 3. Shareholder activism from the other direction. ESG investing, proxy votes on labor and environmental practices. This one ran into a wall of its own. The same concentrated index fund ownership this series discussed in Episode 1 means a handful of asset managers cast an enormous share of all shareholder votes, and their incentives are, unsurprisingly, shareholder return incentives. Every door has a locked room behind it. Here's the room. Delaware is a state that competes for corporate charter revenue. Companies choose where to incorporate, and Delaware's entire fiscal model depends on remaining the jurisdiction corporations prefer. A legal environment that reliably protects shareholder-focused management decisions is a competitive advantage in that market, for the state, not just the companies. Meanwhile, the executives with the power to push for a different model are the same executives whose compensation, over 80% of it equity-based, a number this series established in Episode 2, is directly maximized by the current one. The people who could change the rules are the people the rules are working for. The design layer. So who specifically built this, and when? Milton Friedman, September 13, 1970, New York Times Magazine. That's the ideological origin point, and it's real, but an essay alone doesn't reorganize an economy. It needs institutions willing to carry it forward. The Business Roundtable's 1997 Principles of Corporate Governance is the first major instance of corporate America's own trade association formally codifying the doctrine, not academic argument anymore but a policy document, produced by and for the CEOs who would then run their companies by it. 22 years after that, in August 2019, the same organization reversed course on paper. A new statement on the purpose of a corporation, signed by 181 CEOs, committing to an economy that serves all Americans, and naming customers, employees, suppliers and communities alongside shareholders. Footnote 7. Was 2019 a genuine reversal or a rebranding exercise? The honest answer, per the academic literature that has studied it since, is mixed and worth stating plainly rather than resolved for you. Some researchers found the announcement carried modest positive stock market reactions, consistent with investors reading it as a low-cost signal rather than a binding commitment. Others have pointed out that the signatory company's actual buyback and compensation behavior in the years afterward looked, in aggregate, almost identical to the years before. A statement is not a change in fiduciary case law, and fiduciary case law is what actually binds a board's hand in a shareholder lawsuit. Which is the point this section exists to make. Friedman supplied the ideology. The Business Roundtable supplied the institutional endorsement. But the load-bearing wall was never the essay or the statement. It was Delaware case law's evolving interpretation of fiduciary duty, and the 1982 legalization of the stock buyback mechanism this series detailed in Episode 2, which gave shareholder primacy ideology an actual financial tool to execute at scale. Ideas don't restructure an economy on their own. They need a legal architecture willing to enforce them and a mechanism willing to move the money. By 1997, both existed. By 2024, the fourth episode subject, the buyback machine itself at scale, was simply what the doctrine looked like when it had 50 years to compound. So, here is the plain language version. A magazine essay from 1970 didn't force anything on anyone. It offered corporate America a justification it was already inclined to want. Institutions adopted it over the following decades because the incentives lined up, and by the time anyone tried to reverse it, reversing it meant asking the people it benefits most to vote against themselves. The market is not broken. It was designed by specific people at specific moments, and the design documents have dates on them. Next time, what happens when the index itself becomes the largest shareholder in almost everything? And whether shareholder is even still the right word for what BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street actually are.